Hello again, everyone. This is Alex Toth, part 3, where I'm going to continue reading some of the interviews and essays about him while he was still alive. This is January 2001. This is published. But the next interview I'm going to be doing will have taken place 1991 with Jim Amash. And I remember that name. I remember he did an interview, I think, after Toth died, and he was trying to suggest that he was trying to save him from listening to Rush Limbaugh. He's probably a leftist who tried to, as all leftists try to do, push people away from the right and into the left. But let's see if any of that touches on this interview. So this is Too Much Ado About Alex. Jim Amash talks to the cartoonist in a 1991 interview. And again, this is part of my Alex Toth series. This is my third video, and I'll put it up in my playlist right after this. I drew some doodles here. How dare me do something over a printed Toth self-portrait. But let's get in. Conducted by Jim Amash. Okay. So it says, lest you consider the headline of this interview abusive of the artist, please note it was named thus by Alex for its original appearance in APA 23, a very low circulation Comics Amateur Press Association apazine, published in 1991. CBA thanks Jim Amash, frequent contributor and friend, and artist in his own right, for allowing us to give this remarkable conversation a wider audience. The interview was conducted over the phone in May 1991 and was copy edited by the artist. I like that. I like that Alex took control of the end results just to see if he can clarify and maybe not be misinterpreted. So, Jim Amash says, what were your favorite comics and or newspaper strips as a kid? And Alex Toth says, I was limited to the newspaper that my dad brought home, which was the New York Daily News. So that was the Chicago Tribune and the New York News Syndicate strips. They had Dick Tracy on the front page of the Sunday comic section and Little Orphan Annie on the back, and inside was Terry and the Pirates, Gasoline Alley. Of course, Terry grabbed me. It was pretty exotic stuff. And Little Joe, which was in the same style as Annie, and Smitty. I loved. Smilin' Jack was one of my favorites when I was a little kid because of the airplanes and the cute little gals and the funny characters. Jim Amash goes, when you started reading comics, they were reprints of the newspaper strips? Toth says, yes. I was born in 1928, and when 1933, 1934 came along and the comic book started, I was just old enough to notice. I told you a story about my grade school teacher, Mrs. O'Connor, who gave out at the end of the week a brand new comic book to the best girl and the best boy student of the week. That was our prize for trying to do good work and behaving ourselves. I only won a couple of those because I was always in hot water for some reason or another. But that was a very special prize. That was money out of her own pocket. I have no idea what grade school teachers in New York City were getting in those days. That was her idea to give us a little incentive. 10 cents was a lot of money in those days, and she was spending 20 cents. You'd get a lot of candy and a couple of hamburgers for that, and a lot of rides. 4 rides on the subway. It was a real prize because the comic book was a brand new thing. And she was picking them, and of course they were things like Famous Funnies and some of the reprint one-shots Famous Funnies was putting out. So just to stop for a second, he was at the start, he was right there at the start of comics when he was a kid. That means something also, his kind of connection to comics and why he loved them, why he dedicated his life to them. It was also, you can't I guess, underestimate that. What kind of influence it had on him, what kind of impression. And she was picking them, and of course they were things like Famous Funnies and some of the reprint one-shots Famous Funnies was putting out. The Okie Dokes, Smitties, Barney Googles, and things like that. I have no recollection of these cartoons at all, whether collected or not. If any of you do, that's pretty cool, because I know Terry the Pirates clearly. A Little Orphan Annie, definitely, but the rest I never heard of before. So that was really something. Friday afternoon, just before you went home, you find out if you won or didn't. Nostalgically, sentimentally, I think that's one of the reasons why I have that kind of warm feeling for the comic book. Exactly. The way I first got my hands on them was in that classroom as a prize, and it meant a lot. Amash says, were you drawing at that time? Toth says, oh yes, I was doing drawings for the school. I was doing murals on oak tag paper, which was that buff-colored thick pulp paper, with crayons, because that was all we had. I don't think I used paint. It was all crayon. I don't know whose idea it was. It was either Mrs. O'Connor or it was another teacher. I can't remember her name now. I can see her face because she used to give me a hard time. She encouraged me to do this long panoramic landscape with many sheets of oak tag stuck together, and I had to do it up on top of one of those big old-fashioned high cabinets along a high ceilinged corridor outside the classroom. And this thing was mounted. We taped it or glued it up on the wall way up there, and I had to squat on top of this cabinet, 10 feet off the ground, and do the drawing up there. Now that I think back, that was pretty dangerous. I did this huge long drawing, 8 or 10 feet long, maybe 18 inches high, and I filled it up with something. I have no recollection what it was. I can't remember any other drawings I did in grade school. I was doodling from a very early age. Being an only child, it was company. And Amash asks, do you remember what got you interested in drawing? And Toth replies, I'm sure it was those comics, the Sunday comics in particular. Of course, I'd see the dailies too, but the Sunday comics would grab me. And later, the comic books. I'm sure all that stuff made me want to copy them or whatever. And there was something else that we had in those days. They used to sell the stuff either in the candy store or the dime store. Bottles of white liquid, and you would brush with a swab or a stopper that was attached to the cap. Then you would spread the stuff over any Sunday color comic book page, press clean paper on top, and it would transfer print onto that paper, and you'd set it aside to dry. You'd have all the colors and lines and everything, and still have the original strip. It hadn't lifted all the color and all the black lines off, but still it made a transfer. That kind of turned me on. And then listening to radio drama for kids, adventure shows after school, I used to doodle during those broadcasts, and I think that's what helped me think in terms of storytelling, trying to draw pictures to match what I was hearing on the radio. That's something, huh? It makes sense, because the radio it's just audible, it's just audio. And he's trying to imagine what they were saying looked like. No doubt that helped him get as good as he did, at least from the initial stages. Amash asks, that's one of the things that I find very interesting, because there's nothing like that for a little kid now to use his imagination in that way. Talk about that. This is over 30 years ago, so imagine now with all the screens. Toth responds, no, like TV, a passive entertainment. You just lay there and watch it. Everything is done for you, and it's there all the time, as opposed to the old days when we just had the movies and radio. Your trip to the movies to be entertained was on the average of once, twice a week, but that was about it. It was stimulating when you went to a movie, or in those days to see moving pictures. Now it's there in front of you all the time, 24 hours a day, and that lessens its value. And we see what garbage they fill up 24 hours with. It's a rare thing to see something worthwhile that's produced for it. I enjoy old movies the most. Amash asks, what radio shows were your favorites as a kid? Toth says, oh, all of them. I remember Jack Armstrong to Little Orphan Annie, Captain Midnight, Superman, and Terry and the Pirates. There was a whole string of them, comic book characters as well as comic strip characters. And then Saturdays they had comedy shows, fantasy, fairy tale type shows. One of them was Let's Pretend by Nilla Mack, which was children's fairy tales, and Carlton Myers' Kindergarten, pure comedy. At Grand Central Station, a dramatic half-hour show. Saturday and Sunday nights would be Jack Benny, Burns and Allen, Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy, Red Skelton, among others. And Amash asks, were you interested in adventure? Were you interested in adventure than humor shows? Were you more interested in adventure than humor shows? Excuse me. Toth responds, I was interested in all of them. After school from 3:30 to 5, you had an hour and a half of 15-minute adventure shows. At dinner time, 6 to 7 and thereabouts, Amos and Andy, The Lone Ranger and the Green Hornet, etc. Later, suspense and the detective shows, a great mix of things. Amash asks, were there any artistic members of your family? Toth says, well, my mother drew. That was another reason I started. If you remember that bio page I did for DC, I did a simile of that head that she would draw. If she ever sat down with a pencil and doodled, she would always draw that same profile head. The gal with the bee sting lips, long eyelashes, and marshalled hair? I don't know. I never heard of that. I would copy that. My father was artistic musically. He was writing, producing, directing, and acting in Hungarian plays. I remember he would go to the Hungarian import store to buy the monthly issues of film and theater magazines from Hungary, and would adapt plays in them, some of which he would put on in the New York area. And he goes on, for 1 or 2 years, my father sang at FDR's presidential birthday balls. They would have ethnic groups, singers, comedians, and actors giving readings. He was part of that whole thing and represented the New York City Hungarian community. He sang in his Hungarian costume and was very proud of that. I wish I had pictures of that. He also played the violin and the cymbalum, called a dulcimer in English, the guitar and other instruments, like the harmonica. He and my mother would sing together at home when everything was running smoothly. He'd start playing and singing something, and she'd join right in, and she sang well. My father, having worked in painting contracting, was doing artificial wood grain effects with steel combs, and it was very interesting. You'd lay down a light color, a cream blonde paint, and while it was still tacky, you'd lay a coat of dark varnish or shellac over that. Before that dried, you'd come along with a steel comb, and by increasing or varying the pressure, the teeth would spread wider or closer together again in wavy sweeps across any area, a wall, panel, or door to imitate wood grain. He was very involved in things like that. They were both artistic and in their own little ways. About his parents, they were both artistic in their own little ways. Amash asks, did they ever encourage you to sing since they were singers? Toth says, no, but they wanted me to play an instrument. So I learned the scales on the cymbalum since it was sitting there all day long. I was pretty dumb about learning to do anything more than just a scale. Then he got me a half-size violin. I don't think I got any farther and learned to bow and finger the scale on that and on a guitar. I love music. I grew up with it, but didn't show any skill until many years later when I could sit down at a piano and pick out tunes with the old two-finger. My late wife and I enjoyed playing our own electric organ, and I learned to do better with that, using more fingers with each hand, but still it was just for private fun. Amash asks, did you take art lessons in school? Toth says, yes, I went to the High School of Industrial Arts. That was a half-day vocational, half-day academic. I took book illustration, switched to magazine illustration, a mistake. So I went back to book illustration. That was my major. We had life drawing and 2 periods of illustration class and another class to make up the half a day of vocational study. Amash asks, what kind of encouragement or discouragement did you receive about your artwork, your drawing? Toth says, from my parents, they encouraged me. No one discouraged me. My mother, like every other mother in the world, wanted me to be a lawyer or doctor. I can't remember my father being pro or con. I don't think he really took much notice. I was doodling at age 3. Toth continues, when I got serious about making a living at it, running around visiting publishers with a portfolio, both of them were weird about it. I really didn't get a lot of encouragement then. First of all, they didn't know what it was all about, how all that works. It was foreign to them. The whole idea of visiting publishers, editors, and what that kind of work would entail, or what kind of money, because it was peanuts when I finally did break in 43. I mean, think about that. He was 15 years old, and he broke into the comic book industry. I mean, that's very, very rare to happen today. Probably back then even though Jim Shooter was 13 when he was hired by DC. That's wild. So Amash asks, yeah, I had the same similar background. My parents had no understanding of drawing. And then Toth says, of course I didn't know what I was getting into either. I had no idea what the right thing to do was, but I would look at the phone book, or indicias, if that's how you pronounce it, of the comic books to find the name of the company and editor of the magazine, and I'd call up. Or knowing the address, I would just pop in. I didn't know the importance of making appointments. It's funny he says that because when I was a teenager, I walked into Marvel and I brought my portfolio and I tried to get past the secretary into Jim Shooter's office, and I couldn't get through. So I went to conventions, did the convention route and showed my portfolio. Nothing really came from that either. Look at this. Look at Toth's cartooning. It's pretty wild. Look at that. How good is that? Incredible. The rain. So he goes on. He goes, things were looser in those days anyway. So very often I just walked in the front door with portfolio and asked to see the art director or editor. Humoring me or not, by turns perhaps, but some gents gave me serious criticism of great worth to me. Amash asks, I know about you meeting Jack Cole. Jack Cole was a creator of Plastic Man, who was visually a great character. I know about you meeting Jack Cole, but since I'm going to print the letter you wrote about meeting him, I won't ask for that story again. Who was helpful to you? Toth says, Frank Robbins was very nice to me. I visited him at his apartment to show him my stuff and look over his shoulder as he inked or penciled Scorchy Smith. 1943, the very year I got my break, was the year he began Johnny Hazard for King Features Syndicate. He had months of it ready to roll while still working on Scorchy. When I saw Hazard proof sheets, it was a tight, slick version of his basic style. That's when he told me, I'm leaving Scorchy, going over to King, and this is my new strip. Amash said, you met Mort Meskin around that time too. Toth says, 43 or 44. And Alfred Andriola. I visited his place twice. He was doing Captain Triumph for Quality Comics at that time. Had already stopped doing the Charlie Chan strip and was just marking time before Kerry Drake was ready for syndication. And then Amash asks, you can't remember whether or not you met Lou Fine? Toth says, I did meet him. Somebody, may very well have been Jack Cole, walked me to that back room at Quality where Lou Fine and 3 or 4 other guys were at work. I remember Lou Fine and shaking hands. You seem to have gotten a lot of opinions, Amash mentions. He goes, Toth says, well, Jack Cole was very nice in the way that he tried to help. George Brenner just wanted me the hell out of the office. I was getting in the way of his people. Jack Binder was pretty offensive to make me tear up my portfolio when I left his office. Whoa, I remember that. He goes, Jack Binder was pretty offensive to me to make me tear up my portfolio when I left his office. I just tore everything up, page by page, and threw it in the garbage can on the corner. He made me hate everything I'd done. It was probably a good thing in the end. I had to draw all new pieces for my portfolio. Out of that came better drawings. That's tough love right there, man. But clearly it had an impact. I mean, he got better and better and better. But that's tough. I couldn't do that. So Masha asks, which professionals did you spend time with in those days? Toth says Shelley Mayer, who I visited at 225 Lafayette Street. It's amazing his memory here. He knows his school teachers' names. He knows the addresses of these professionals. The MC Gaines office. He was a great friend and helped me a lot. I remember my first visit. I was a big fan of Erwin Hayson's Wildcat. He liked Hayson's work. He thought well of me because I saw in Hayson's work what he saw. He brought in a set of Erwin's originals on Wildcat, and I thought they were gorgeous. When he took them back out and gave them to somebody in production, and unbeknownst to me, he asked them to make full-size stats of those pages and to mount them on page blanks that DC printed for their artists, plus lots of extra pages so I could practice my lettering on their blue-line guides for size and consistency. So when I left that day, he surprised me not only with all that, but also with a reducing glass, because he said, every time you draw a page or panel, I want you to look at it through this glass and see how it's going to come down in print, and see how clear it's going to be. If it isn't clear, simple enough, change whatever needs changing and simplify it. This is the best tool you can have by your drawing board. He told me to come back to practice my lettering, to learn how to letter well. Every cartoonist ought to be able to letter himself and not have anyone else do it. Absolutely. Agree with that. The one thing I don't remember getting encouragement to do was writing. And I wish that had been thumped into my head from the very beginning, so I would have paid more attention to that and not just trying to improve the art. And that's for sure. You know, writing and drawing your stories, man, that's just so important to write them well. So Amasha says, I know you had a studio with Joe Kubert for a few months in 1949. Who were you seeing socially as far as comics professionals were concerned? Toth says, Erwin Hayson and I lived just across the park from each other. He on the west side, me on the east. We'd work together. I'd bring my stuff over, set up my laptop. I'd bring my stuff over, set up my lapboard, and a laptop back then, against his drawing table, and we'd listen to the radio, talk, work, go out to grab a bite to eat, and then come back and work some more. In that movie, by the way, Simplicity, The Life of Alex Toth, which is available, I think, on YouTube even. It was part of a Space Ghost DVD set that I got years ago. Erwin Hayson was talking in there. He was very old in the video. It was after Toth died. And he mentioned he was so surprised that Toth liked his stuff. So funny. It was very funny about it. He was so surprised because he knew Toth was a master. And from what I saw from Erwin Hayson's work, it was good, Wildcat. But it wasn't Toth, and I think he knew that, Erwin Hayson. He was all surprised that Toth loved his stuff. It's just funny. So Toth goes on about his relationship with Hayson. And then I'd go home. Sometimes my mother would send a pot full of Hungarian cooking with me. Then we'd have a feast at his place. That was fun because he loved Hungarian cooking. My mother's, anyway. Amash says, didn't Carmine Infantino and Frank Giacoa, I thought it was Giacoa, I think it's Frank Giacoa, I believe, start at DC about the same time? Toth says, yes, we started about a week apart. We buddied around a lot. Amash says, did you ever feel like you were competing with anyone? Toth says, no, never. I don't think any of us did. I wasn't aware of competing at DC. We were just happy to be there, to be working at DC. I was anyway. We had our problems, but that was the place to work as far as I was concerned. Marvel never interested me that much, and vice versa. And it's just as well. I was never their type of cartoonist, and they were never my my type of company. And I was content with the big, solid, conservative organization of DC Comics. I liked our comic books better than theirs, our cartoonists better than theirs, the whole package. He ended up doing an issue of the X-Men, I don't know if it was issue 9 or 10, with the Juggernaut. And I think it was a mixture of him and Kirby. It was very strange. If I didn't know it was Toth, I probably wouldn't have guessed, because I think Vince Colletta inked it. It was very strange. It was like a mixture between Toth and Kirby, which is, I don't know. I mean, there couldn't be two more different artists. Toth mentioned at one time where he and Jack Kirby met for lunch one day in California, and he says, at least Toth relayed that, he goes, we didn't quite understand each other. He goes, we just couldn't connect. But he, Toth understood and said, well, he's the king, so that's cool. Okay. So he was talking about competing, and he just preferred DC to Marvel, never really quite got Marvel. And then Amash asks, what led you to wanting to tell stories in picture form? And Toth says, I used to doodle while listening to old radio shows. I tried to draw what I was hearing, put faces to the voices and settings to the action, to interpret what I was hearing into little pictures. I didn't really think about art of any kind as a living until a junior high school teacher, Mr. London, took me aside and said, you can make money with your ability to draw. You're not bad. He recommended that I go to the high school of Industrial Arts, which I did. This high school was just a few blocks from my home and very convenient. It was there that I met some friends who were wacko about doing comics. So did my schoolmates, Jack Katz, Ezra Jackson, and Pete Morrissey, PAM. And I got the fever to actually do it, because I was a dum-dum when I started and remained so for some time. Learning how to tell a story came from men like Shelley Mayer. His influence opening my eyes to things I didn't even know were there. I studied art, illustration, movies, and radio shows in a totally different way. I read books, magazines, and studied comic strip techniques. I was able to see and enjoy them more. The combination cracked. I was privy to more information, though I didn't know what to look for until the right people opened my eyes to the never-ending process of self-education throughout one's life. Absolutely, never-ending process. Once you think you figured it all out and you're as good as you'll ever be, you stagnate. It's not good for any artist. I don't care how good they are. Even the best says this, and it's absolutely true. I mean, you always got to learn. You can never stop. You can always get better too, always. That's a one field, Athletics, clearly you can't. You have to stop at a certain point. But art, writing, you can, and a lot of artists don't get better. Sometimes they deteriorate. They become a lot worse, but it doesn't have to be the case. If you're a sincere, honest artist and want to tell your stories, or if you got a lot to say, there's no reason for you to get worse with age at all. And then Amash says, you say Mayer opened your eyes. What did he discuss with you? Toth says he would insist, tell the story. Tell the bloody story. Don't try to be self-consciously arty. Don't be Rembrandt. He gave everybody a hard time about that, including Joe Kubert. Just keep it simple and follow the script. Interpret it as best you can. Clearly, simply tell the story. That's awesome. About Kniff and Bob Kane, he said, gag cartoonists who went straight to do illustrative stuff, they'll always do better at it and tell the story better than taking the reverse, because gag cartoonists already know what to leave out and what to put in to put the gag over. Always dealt with simplicity. For them to add is easier than for the rest of us to subtract, to realize how little information you need to provide the reader. That's very good. He made his point with these examples, and I saw some validity in that. More and more as I got older, adapting some of that in my own work, though at the mercy of scripts I was given, with few exceptions. I didn't have total control until I started writing my own. Amaj says, how did you get your very first assignment in comics? Toth says, it was Funnies Inc. They gave me a page of pencils to do. I had visited Famous Funnies and there wasn't anything happening. I went back again and got my first $5 spot drawing to do for their text stories. They liked the drawing and gave me a 2-spot drawing assignment next time. That was $10, and finally, I got my first 1-page story. All the stories in Heroic Comics were based on actual news events. That first story was about a telephone lineman in the snow or something. I can't remember if I or staff letterer Charlie Winters did the copy, because my lettering was still lousy. That 1 page for Funnies Inc., my dim recollection tells me that it was a teenage humor page of some sort. That was for George Capitan, but he couldn't give me any more assignments. I was starting to get cracking for Famous Funnies, so I just stayed with them. I didn't try to get outside work for a while. Amaj says, so when you went to work for Famous Funnies, you went directly to work for Steve Douglas, right? Toth says, no. There was a woman editor there. I believe her name was Mrs. Bloom, and she was very pregnant. Steve Douglas was a U.S. Army warrant officer with Will Eisner at Special Services. I met them one day at the office when he introduced me to Eisner. I mean, damn, 2 giants right there. Their offices were nearby. Before long, Mrs. Bloom was gone to have her baby, and Steve Douglas was back. That was still 1943. At one point, Amaj says, at one point, you simplified your art style radically from one story to the next. 1 second. So again, he goes, at one point, you simplified your art style radically from one story to the next. Toth says, yeah, that was for Murray Boltinoff on Sierra Smith, and he hated it. He wanted me to go back to all that hay, all those pen lines. I can imagine. Hey, you got to add some more pen lines. Must be a pain in the ass. I can't stand that myself. Again, authentic detail, absolutely. Machinery, cars, detailed walls here and there you want to do, wood. I get it. Things you can't skimp on those. But lines, excess lines for no reason? No, man. Not as an artist. You don't want to get in the way either of the story. Again, you don't have to be... now, some people think stark is like really stark art. That's like Toth. No, Toth, look, I mean, he adds detail where it's necessary. He definitely does, but he just doesn't bury it in detail. He doesn't feel the lack of confidence that a lot of artists who do that feel the need to do. Cover up. Every corner of the panel, have to cover it all up. You don't have to do that. You really don't. You can have some white space sometimes, some black space. You can have silence. So you can have one character with no background sometimes. It works visually and for the story. So he says here, all those pen lines. Amaj says, Sol Harrison was the one who told you the line about leaving things out, quote unquote. Okay, so Toth says, you don't know what to leave out. It's very nice, but you don't know what to leave out. I didn't learn how to leave things out for years with few exceptions. For Julie Schwartz and Bob Kanigher, I drew a story about a cowboy who fights a bull. That was done with a more severe open style. The cowboy was modeled after Randolph Scott. It was similar to the style I used for that one time on Sierra Smith, and I got my hand slapped for it. Then I did that Foreign Legion story that I penciled, lettered, and inked, which was also a switch from the Sierra Smith style. I showed you that the other day, actually. Beautiful. But not much. It was the old flexible Gillette pen, which I never really got the hang of. So Amaj says, so when you inked, what did you normally ink with? You didn't use that much brush, did you? Toth says, no, because I'd like to use the pen for hands, heads, faces, detail, and outlines. I'd use the brush for drapery and blacks. That's true. for myself, I've been going back and forth, pens, markers, brushes. Table for one, it's all brush. It's all brush. Pigman, the Killian parts is pen. The Pigman parts are all brush. The story I'm doing now, pen, brush, all mixed. It's the first time I'm doing that for the main artwork. So, I'm sorry, but these things just spark those things in my mind. I hope you don't mind that. I just want to engage a little more in that with my personal experience doing it. He goes, no, because I like to use the pen for hands, heads, faces, detail, and outlines. I'd use the brush for drapery and blacks. That would vary. Sometimes I try the brush first. I would always switch. I always try another way of doing something to not bore myself to death and to find an easier way to work. You know, it's so funny. People sometimes, not that they made fun of Toth, but he used a felt tip marker, right? Sometimes he inked his work, so the original art, when you see it now, it's brown. The ink lines are brown because it fades out with time. It's not India ink. It's a cheaper ink. Still personally, I mean, Toth's finished look, to me, was the finest finished look of any artist when he inked it himself. And it's, again, felt tip. I don't care what the hell he used. The end result was beautiful, and it worked. Absolutely worked. Unlike anyone. You know, he was his finest inker, and I could argue one of the greatest inkers of all time as well. And letterers as well. So he continues. Toth says, I really didn't like the Gillette pen, but there seemed to be very little else to use except going to speedball pens, which I'd also try. I'd file down a lot of them and play around with them. Then I got a hold of the radiograph, and really used it almost exclusively with brush, and then later markers for backup blacks and drapery from 52 on when I went over to standard. And Amash says, you did some work for EC that is well thought of today. It wasn't easy for you to work with Harvey Kurtzman, was it? Another great cartoonist. Toth says, the pay was low and the work was pretty demanding, and it was too restrictive, limiting, working from his layouts. He had his viewpoint, which I agreed with most of the time, but didn't on the third story, and we argued and called it a day. That's tough to get, pages that are already paneled and drawn and say, okay, go finish this. It's you're limited by someone else's art. Amash says, what did you do after the Korean War? Toth says, I was not in the shooting war. That had quieted down just as I reached Japan in 1956. I came out of service and went to LA, where I got work with Western Publishing. I had briefly visited New York, and business was terrible. Stan Lee said, Alex, get out of the business because it's dead or it's dying. There isn't any work to go around. Sills are off. Nobody knows what to do to save it. Get into something else that you can make money in. He said, we've got our rates to $22 a page. I don't dare offer you or any other pro that. Wow. Even those days, that's low. It's interesting. He had a relationship with Stan Lee. Was telling him, Alex, don't do it. Don't waste your time. Pretty wild. He goes, I don't dare. He goes, what can I do? I'm using kids out of art school who'll take it. He goes, but, this is Toth now, but I did 2 Western stories for him. He wasn't too crazy about either one of them. Years later, I did an X-Men story and a Kid Called 2. Back in LA, Chuck McKimson, my art director at Western, in 56, was very good to work for. A nice guy and the brother of the famous Warner Brothers animation directors, Bob and Tom McKimson. Flash. It's more like a comic strip here. Jules Verne's. And then he says, Amash says, you're famous for your storytelling ability, but your storytelling sense didn't seem well developed in the early days. Certainly not compared to the work in the last half of your career. What helped you to improve? It's a little presumptuous because I'll tell you one thing. Right out of the gate, Toth was something else. He was a dynamo. I mean, he was like I remember hearing stories from artists like Joe Cuban and others talk about him and say, we knew he was the best. He was a kid. He was younger than us. They said, we knew he was the best. And Toth wasn't arrogant about it, you know. He just busted his ass. He tried to get better and better and better, and he did. He outdrew them all, is what it came down to. So he goes, what helped you improve? What helped you to improve? So Toth says, I think just constantly trying to learn and grow, colored by my observations and studies of things. Old movies or TV shows like The Naked City, The Defenders, and so many wonderful series coming out of New York in those old black and white days. The acting, directing, location shooting had a real gritty feel to it. The wonderful acting, I studied everything and anything around me to use in my work. Getting involved with animation helped me a great deal too. That carried over to my strip and movie work. Amash says, it seems like your work in animation had a profound effect on the way you drew comic books. Toth says, yes. First of all, I was forced into more economy in animation. Absolutely true. I think that's what really did it for him. It doesn't require much detail, so it fit right in like a glove for him. Paul Smith, the X-Men artist who drew about 10 comics, X-Men comics, Uncanny X-Men, had a simple style as well, almost like a coloring book style. If you see it in black and white, there was some blacks in there, but most of it was very open. I think could he have done animation? I don't know, Paul Smith. But he says here, he goes, he was forced into more economy in animation, appreciating it more and finding ways to adapt certain techniques. I'm yawning here. Sorry about that. Just had a long day. I'm going to finish this interview and then go. But he goes on, and from other forms of graphic art as well, and then going back to the work of German cartoonists and posterists. Interesting. The Swiss, French, Czech, and Polish posterists, which struck my fancy, and characterists, political cartoonists from World War I. Amash says, after your animation work in the 60s, you made more use of solid black areas of silhouettes. For instance, the 1964 Atom and Flash story for The Brave and the Bold was unlike your House of Mystery and House of Secrets art in the late 60s. Toth says, but I owe this to the material given. Whatever I do in my approach to a story is because of the type of story it is. Mystery, Western, I bend to serve the needs of the story. I mean, come on, man. That's just, again, it can't be overstated, these type of things. You know, whereas you get some artists like a Jim Lee, let's say, he probably would do everything the same if it's a horror story or not. You know, I think he tried to do something different with that. Death Blow, he tried to mimic Miller's Sin City style, if you recall. And I remember Miller was friendly with Image at the time, but then Miller had a column in one of those magazines and he called him out. You know, he called out Jim Lee. It was very strange, but so again, Jim Lee is, I think, he'll be Jim Lee no matter what, whereas Toth was saying if it's a horror, if it's mystery, he can really mix it up. And in eerie, you can tell that. In the eerie and creepy collection that I have, you can really see that in there. Okay, so he goes, I bend to serve the needs of the story. Beautifully put and true. He goes, too many comic book cartoonists do the expected thing. No matter what kind of story you hand them, it all comes out the same. They have not bent or served the needs of the story. A love story, adventure, Western, or whatever, it all winds up looking the same. That's boring. It's also a conceit on the part of the artist for not growing, learning, giving that new script a chance. All stories have separate consideration. Awesome. He goes, I want to be surprised by scripts. Whether scripts were good or mediocre, I try to find something to get excited by. Sometimes possible, sometimes not. If there really was no way to save it, then I'd hack it out. That's unfortunate. Amash says, one thing you do well is your use of depth of field. In doing an aerial scene, I get the real feeling of space. And Toth says, well, sometimes I pull it off. Sometimes I don't. We've talked about Mobius being the master at that. He's done it very well with simplicity. He's very clever in the way he uses line overlapping shapes in space. Any composition depends on what's most important, what the dialogue and captions say, who's saying what in the panel, or who's most important in the shot. You compose to that. Depends on what you want to stress. If you want to move the reader's eye to what's important, you eliminate non-essentials. And then he goes, Amash says, Noel Sickles drew complex objects in a simple way. It's true. Toth says, yes. While Roy Crane, who didn't use texture marks, would do his bold crosshatch with pen or brush and grease pencil grays. He didn't need texture marks. He did it with duotone, board, or crosshatching, spotting blacks so boldly, simply. Everything looked solid. He took out what everyone else was trying to put in. Beautiful. Amash says, you were doing that too. Toth says, it's a temptation to put it all in. It's a temptation to put it all in. It's deceptive fun. Corbin's excellent at that and uses texture nicely. That's a way of indicating depth of field. Something up close can have a fuzzy edge because it's out of focus. The middle ground can be in focus with texture marks. The background can be loosely indicated without detail. Your middle ground is your focus point, center of focus. You can reverse that to foreground. You've got a hand in close-up and whatever is behind is out of focus. You shift focus to reveal, to explain, to clarify, to impact. It's a master just talking about these things. He did it all. And again, his library is not as big as Kirby and the others. It's not. For a number of years, he didn't work when he was able to. But what he did in the time that he did, work on it, it's just, again, it's a body of work that I just think is extraordinary. And then, of course, you have a guy like Dave Mazzucchelli, who's another master, who produced, he drew Batman Year One, he drew Daredevil Born Again. Better stories than any that Toth has drawn, unfortunately. So he also has that kind of limited career-wise. He didn't draw that many comics, but man, when he did, they were extraordinary and they were well-written too. Toth didn't have that necessarily. It was always his art that made the story stand out. Now there were some fun ones and creepy and eerie, which we'll get to. But in terms of all-time great stories, it's, I wish he had done something like Batman Year One, like Daredevil Born Again. I wish he had done something like that. Anyway, so he goes here. Amash says, let's imagine a 3-panel sequence. First panel, Bravo. That's Alex Toth's character, Jesse Bravo. They did Bravo for Adventure with. That's his, they call it his magnum opus. That's his story, wrote, penciled, inked, lettered it, did the works. A pretty long story too, but I think 100 pages. He goes, Amash says, let's imagine a 3-panel sequence. First panel, Bravo is talking to a mechanic in the foreground as we see a plane landing in the background. They're still talking in the second panel as Bo gets out of the plane. In the third panel, Bo is in middle ground and shouts to Bravo and the mechanic. They look towards him as you shift the focus on Bo. At this point, Bo is most important. Toth says, yes, if you pull your foreground figures to the sides and frame Bo with them. We focus on Bo, who's speaking as he approaches. They can be in silhouette or with their heads turned away at Bo. You can't help but look at him first. He doesn't need to be drawn with much detail, just enough to show the expression on his face, to carry the line of dialogue, and whatever importance you give it to his clothes or what his hands may be doing. You design the panel accordingly. Move your camera around, high, low, or just straight on. Highlight what's most important, framing the shot as I described it. You may have a ground line and an indication of the plane behind him, but use as little of that as possible because it may distract from Bo. Another thing, it's very, very important. Sometimes you can frame things within a panel. have black around a character who's in light colors, have white around a character who's dressed in black, and so on. You can always frame that. And Amash says, in the first two panels, we see airplane hangars in the background and a mountain range behind them. What happens to them? Toth says, once you've established them, no need to repeat it at all. The reader will know they're there. You can show part of a hangar or the plane. True. It's absolutely true. You can have an establishing shot and put as much detail as you want. Put the works in, right? You don't have to do that repeatedly. You really don't. It's a waste of time, a waste of space on the page, and also it distracts from the story being told. Make that incredible establishing shot. Of course, put as much detail as you want in there, as much authentic necessary detail. Again, detail is one thing, right? Drawing something, but making lines for the hell of it, like McFarlane does sometimes, it's nasty. It's like that's not detail. It's just filling up space in a lazy way. And again, I know I get on him sometimes, but I did like his Hulk, Tom McFarlane's Hulk. His Spider-Man I couldn't stand. I just couldn't stand it. It was so weak. Anyway. So, okay. He says you don't have to repeat it at all. The reader will know they're there. And Amash says, what if you show background to establish their environment? Toth says, still minimalize it as much as possible. The further away you are from a subject, the less worked it needs to be. A lot depends on instinct. For instance, if you have a page or 6 panels and 4 of them are dull, only talking heads, you've got to give it a pictorial value or the whole page is a loser. You try to find some eye appeal for the reader so the page will work. You can't do anything about the lousy writing. You can move the camera to a long shot so that there's something in the foreground that is interesting enough to be there. It may distract or for a second, but you're establishing that these guys are talking. He goes, if they're walking along, then change the background to make it interesting. Since you are only doing talking heads and there's only 6 panels on that page, you're giving those panels too much space. The amount of space given each scene is one's own personal choice. Sometimes the story point may dictate a wide shot, the whole width of the page, or if nothing's happening, just talking, give it that less space. Just get the copy in. Maybe a 2-shot close-up would be interesting because of expressions, and get on with the more interesting stuff in the next panel. Amash says, can interesting lighting save it? Toth says, you don't want to falsely dramatize a scene. If you overdo it, it loses its punch. Save it for when you really need it. Amash says, then let's go back to the 3rd panel in the Bravo sequence. You have dramatic lighting in the main figures. What kind of lighting do you have on Bo or what's behind him? Toth says, that's optional. If they're all standing in the same light source, then it's simple. Because then it's simple. What do you say here? One second. Light source, you have dramatic. Because that's optional. If they're all standing in the same light source, then it's simple. If you get real Hollywood about it, you can cheat all kinds of top lighting, backlighting, whatever you want to reveal or conceal things, to move and focus the eye of the reader. Amash says, how about defining shapes? Toth says, if the shape of your object is set down right, you don't need too much information. Overlapping shapes aid in defining depth of field, knowing what to hide, what to show, simplify, draw what's important. Amash says, when you did that Batman story, you had clouds in the sky on the last 4 panels, but on the last panel, you backlit the clouds as the sun came up. Toth says, passage of time is interesting. Archie's script was too. Archie Goodwin. Great editor, great writer. He did a number of stories with Toth. Amash says, you seem to cut to the essence of whatever scene you happen to be drawing. Toth says, most important is thinking time. Thinking is what makes the difference. I couldn't agree more, my God. Thinking is what makes the difference. About what you're doing graphically with basic story material. Everything boils down to how long you thought out the problem. And that's a thing. Less thinking, more lines, more bullshit on the page. More thinking, more solid the drawings are. Better composition. You're not trying to show off. You're just trying to say, how can I best draw this panel, this scene, this moment? What's the best way I can do that? And again, if you don't do that hard work, and it's the hardest work, writing and even thinking, you can just doodle away and ink away and just cover up every corner of the page. And if you take away all that, detail, it's not that good. The placement of the figure is not that good. The storytelling is not that good. But if you can just design the page as best you can with a good storytelling, you don't have to add all that crap. And again, I do detail in my work sometimes, absolutely. Less so than most artists, I will say. But detail for detail's sake, I can't stand it. I just can't. So he says here, these guys are talking. It may distract for a second. Okay, anyway, I'm going to reread a little of this also. Toth says, you try to find some eye appeal for the reader so the page will work. You can't do anything about the lousy writing. You can move the camera to a long shot so that there's something in the foreground that is interesting enough to be there. It may distract for a second, but you're establishing that these guys are talking. I probably read that, but let me just read them a little more here. If they're walking along, then change the background to make it interesting. Since you are only doing talking heads and there's only 6 panels on that page, you're giving those panels too much space. I'm sorry if I reread this. I apologize. Here we are. Completely lost track. Sorry. Again, Toth says, most important is thinking time. Thinking is what makes the difference about what you're doing graphically with basic story material. Everything boils down to how long you thought out the problem. As Roy Crane said, think more, draw less. Think more, draw less. Think more, draw less. If artists can get that in their heads, we'd have better comics. Think more, draw less. At first it sounds like a joke, but it's not. You know the old cliche, less is more? But there's a lot of truth there. Cliches just happen to be old truths repeated, so people ignore what the words say and mean. Toth says, to think deeply about what one is doing is not done much anymore in film, animation, comics, illustration, whatever. There isn't enough questioning, seeking of answers, and finding other ways to make it more interesting and valuable to yourself as you do the work or to the reader. That's where the fun is, to find new ways to interpret. He goes on, thinking is where most of the fun is. It's hard work and frustrating most of the time, 100%. When you're trying to find new ways. Often you think back remembering bits and pieces of old movies, TV, cartoons, books you've read, certain effects you saw in painting or graphic art that it fit your present work at hand. These little triggers spin off into other ideas. Pretty soon you found some way to do what may be a cliche scene that you've seen in 1,000 times before. Not to be tricky or cute about it, but to honestly serve that story. Amar says, unfortunately, a lot of comics and films bore their audience. Toth says, bore and confuse them because of muddled thinking, depictions, and interpretations. Amar says, I don't think your work is affectatious. Toth says, I hope not. See, again, it's not that he's humble, because he knows he does the best he can do, Toth, right? But he's not the kind of guy who says, of course it's not. He says, I hope not. It's an attitude. It's a healthy attitude for an artist to have, to know that you give your best, but also you can say, damn, maybe I could do better. But also one thing, I never let go of work unless I know it's the best I can do. Sometimes that takes some time to get to that point. But sometimes I'm like, you know what? Sometimes you throw something out there and it's like, wow, that came out good right out of the gate. Other times you got to do 5 revisions until you get it. And sometimes you can't get that one thing right no matter what. It's a pain in the ass, but man, it's worth it to go through that as well, because that is a well-earned drawing. So Toth says, Amar says, I don't think your work is efficacious. Toth says, I hope not. There have been times where I reached for something that was just damn silly. Huh. It was evident to everyone when it didn't work. I burnt my fingers many times. Amar says, I think one night scene in Bravo when you backlit everyone. Toth says, it was a happy event that it worked. I don't think I intended to backlight everybody because I did ink a lot of those faces and figures. You see more of his work here and here. He goes, figures in detail before I changed my mind and decided that it might be a very good spot to do that. He goes, I did it. It just seemed to work. The figures overlapped clearly enough as they were staged and posed, and it was a happy accident that rimmed light around everyone to read the figures clearly enough in reduction. Yeah, check out Bravo for Adventure, just for the sheer beauty of the art. Story's fine. It's not great. He means it when he says they didn't tell me. He gets pissed off when they didn't push him to write stories. It's fine. I mean, it's a serviceable story. It's fun. The character's likable, but it's the art that really does it. I just wish that he could have been able to draw a great story. And again, he did some good stories here and there, some short ones which were great. A few ones, Daddy and the Pie and whatnot, just beautiful stuff. But man, in terms of having a graphic novel, a thick one, drawn by Toth that is as good the writing as it is his art, it doesn't exist, unfortunately. So Amash says, you gave the reader enough detail as to who all the figures were. Even with the silhouettes, I knew who was who. You told me that for every finished page you used, you threw away one or two. Wow. I've thrown away pages myself. It's you can't help it sometimes. It's like, no, that's just not working. But then the next one is always better. Always. He goes, Toth says, a lot of work was done over and over since I was writing, had a rough outline of that story, and was going through a tough emotional crisis at the time. His wife was hospitalized at the time. I think she died not long after, unfortunately. So he was doing his magnum opus while that was happening. This was my very first long writing and drawing a job, and my first original copyrighted character book for Europe. So it was very important to get it right. I think he was doing it for a French publication, if I'm not mistaken. He goes, I'd sit down every day, go back to page 1 and reread every page, no matter how deep into the story I was, right up to where I'd stopped the day before. I wouldn't recommend that to anybody. Well, and I'd never done it since, but I did it then because I didn't want any hanging plot threads. I wanted everything connected. I had 48 pages to do it in, 12 pages at a whack as episodes for serialization. But it was 48 pages, but then he added, I think, another 20 or 30 at one point. So ended up being, I think, at least the collection that I have, over 100 pages. Background material, things that he cut. Very often I would find that I had gone off on a tangent and had to fix it. I was writing, penciling, and inking it page by page by page. If I discovered tomorrow that I had left something out or strayed off on an angle that I shouldn't have, there was no choice but to tear it up and start all over again and pull it back into line. Man, I would have loved to have had those torn up pages. He goes, it wasn't very professional, just chipping away bit by bit. Considering everything that was going on in my life, I'm amazed that it got done at all. Amash says, if there is anything you've done that's really you, then Bravo is it. That's for sure. Toth says, and I've never really come up with anything since then that has really been quite like that. I don't know why. I've got outlines for plots that could work, but it seems like I did it and there it is. Time to move on or just not move on. Time to move on or just not move at all. Amash says, you tore up the original splash after publication. Why did you tear it up? Toth says, I really didn't like that figure. I don't know why I let it go the first time. Once I had something better, I didn't want to see it anymore. When I'm through with something, I'm through with it, and that's it. Like most people, I don't like to be reminded of my mistakes. I certainly don't want to save them. I should never have allowed that original splash page to be run. I've torn up lots of pages in the inking stages when there was a little else left for me to do. I'm not crazy about white paint, especially with markers. White markers is a no-no. It turns into gray mud. The easiest way was to tear it up and begin again. Amash says, let's go back a little earlier to another story that I thought was you. The classic Cord story, Hot Wheels number 5. True. Great. Tool says, that was fun. Amash says, was that the first story you wrote that got published? Toll says, no, I had written a couple of shorts for Warren and a few things for the auto cartoon magazines like Big Daddy Roth, Peterson's Cartoons, and Hot Rod Cartoons. Then, of course, Pete Millar's Drag Tunes magazine. That was fun. Working for Warren, I did write a few 7-page stories, few and far between. That led me down the path to Bravo. Amash says, how restricted was it to work for DC in the 1950s? Say the script called for 6 panels on a page, 3 tiers of 2 panels. Were you allowed to deviate from that? Toth said there was no fixed layout. At DC, where I grew up, quote unquote, we had page blanks printed in non-photographic blue, divided into halves, quarters, and thirds, across and down with the lettering guidelines top to bottom. So you could break down that page in any way that you saw fit. Simon and Kirby, Morton Meskin, and Kubert all did some pretty wild stuff. Amash says, I'm going to digress for just a second here. Toth says, of course you will. Funny. Amash says, because you started mentioning other people, are you familiar with the story of Bernie Krigstein doing Master Race? And Toth says, he changed the story length from 6 pages to 8 pages. He added panels, transition shots, made more work and trouble for himself for good reason, as he proved. Amash says sometimes he would break the panel up, one person responding to another in the next panel, rather than the whole scene taking place in the same panel. Toth says he did it at Marvel and had Dick Briefer doing it in the 50s. Crime stories that looked like they had 20 panels a page. Everybody was doing it. Amash says, but you didn't. Toth says, no. I used transition shots here and there when I thought it might be interesting. It was a tendency to slow down the story. It's a gimmick, just like in movies, where everything is normal speed until you get to the big shootout. Everybody getting shot, glasses breaking, blood spurting, bodies falling in slow motion is an obvious trick for effect only by the director and cameraman. You don't need that. Amash says, you thought that what Krigstein was doing was affectatious? Toth says, well, it was his way of seeing a story, and he made it work his way. Eisner did a lot of that in his spirit, and it did it well. Didn't overdo it. Used it where it counted. Eisner was as innovative as anyone, ever. You look at those spirit, designs, those opening pages, incredible. I love that Toth recognizes that. Of course he would. So he says, Amash says, Steranko talks about the element of time. Did you speed up or slow down time in stories? Toth says, I think too much is made of that, of places to squeeze that effect into a strip. Very rarely does continuity require that kind of thing, because I've used it and abused it myself. Most of the time it's misused and slows things down too much. It's misplaced emphasis. Amash says, you believe in keeping the pace up? Toth says, yes. If there's a good reason to slow down, if written well, if you've got a pacing to do it, if you got a pacing to it, a rise and fall, a speed up and a slow down, quiet moments, you can slow it down with silence or minimal dialogue to make a valid dramatic point. You're slowing down to establish or register something, a dramatic, poignant, or restful story point. It can be a panoramic landscape, establishing the setting, or an interior where a lot of action will later occur. It's an old movie device, the quote-unquote establishing shot, letting your audience get a good look at it before you move in and start your medium and close-up shots, crossovers, reverses, angles. Amash says, when Shooter was editor-in-chief at Marvel, he noticed that a lot of the artists didn't know how to establish a scene so that the reader could turn to any page of the story and know where he was. Toth says that's because of a lack of thinking, training, experience, and awareness of techniques used in movies, television, and animation. Kniff wrote about daily strips, opening and establishing shots, and moves in tighter and tighter to panel 4 for the big close-ups, punchline. But that's too mechanical and formulaic. I don't like formula. Cast in cement solutions or rules which say this is the only way to do it. There are too many exceptions, 100%. I mean, there are principles to follow, right? Follow the truth also of the art of the story to wherever it leads. But to be locked into something like that, no. So Amash says, in Bravo, Jesse and Vivi are in the diner and he's to be taken for a ride by two hoods. They're walking out of the diner past two pitchers at a counter. Instead of showing Viv grabbing them and bopping the hoods over the head, you have a shot of the pitchers on a tray. In the next shot, the pitchers are gone, before and after. I love that. Toth says, it's a device, a tool, lifted from movies. Something is there and then it's not. Or something isn't there and suddenly it is. It's a good storytelling device, best used in humor, to set up a gag and make it pay off. It has its place in dramatics, too. There's a gun belt hanging on a hook in the sheriff's office. You cut to the sheriff, you cut back to the hook, and the gun belt is gone. With the gun, of course. So you wonder who has it, and then there's the payoff. Amash says, or the scene in your Torpedo story where Luca has to kill a friend. Man, that was awesome. If you haven't read that, Torpedo. I think Torpedo in 1936. He only did a few of those stories, and they were black and white. But the way they colored also in another edition was fantastic. Really well done color. He goes, with a scene in your Torpedo story where Luca has to kill a friend. The old friend embraces Luca. Toth says, you have a tape of Double Indemnity? He goes, in it, Fred McMurray shoots Barbara Stanwyck the same way. She can't believe it. It's an old thing that's been done many, many times. You lead the audience to believe one thing and then you double-cross them. The switch, surprise, is what it's all about. Amash says there's one major difference in what the director did and what you did. While Luca and the friend are embracing, the friend's hands stiffen. You have to pay attention to realize he's been shot by Luca. I remember that. Toth says it's a little subtlety, and I'm sure a lot of readers didn't get it. Or maybe they got it after a second look, which means I failed. It should have been made clear enough that something was happening off camera. I don't want to try to, pretend I know more than I do, but I remember I saw that, and it was obvious to me at least. His hands were popped out because they were hugging, then his hands were off him quick. Amar says, I don't think you failed because unlike Double Indemnity, there is no sound. We don't hear a blam. It was done silently, subtly, despite the fact that there was a sound effect. He goes, I remember when I read it and said, wait a minute, did he shoot him? Toth says, I'm ambivalent about the use of sound effects. In some stories I go ape and use a lot from beginning to end because I thought they required or because of my particular mood. I like to see sound effects used well. There have been other stories where I use no sound effects at all. I'm never comfortable either way. Sometimes it ends up being a strange mix of both. That's not too terrific either, or consistent. Because how far do you go? You have Eisner's use of drip, drip, drip of rain, then the clip, clop sound of feet along wet pavement. How far do you carry that? Do you have the honk of the taxi at the corner? Or the wall of the police siren in the night? If you carry it to the extreme, your panels will be filled from beginning to end with extraneous sound effects that you can't help but hear. So you try to pick the ones that really count. In Bravo, it was a high dramatic moment when I used a lot of them near the climax of that night scene. There's the car chase across the field, and then Bo takes the plane up. I had to use sound effects in order to show that the engine was cutting out, sputtering, and he didn't have a chance of making it. And he had been shot. I went heavy on the sound effects in that part of Bravo. It was a pretty quiet story, not many sound effects used. But as I got to the end and things were getting pretty fast, dramatic, and hot, I started using them in the big finish. If you'll study Caniff's Terry, you'll see long periods where he didn't use sound effects. Then for some reason in some episode, he did. Hard to figure. Some say with Sickles, same way with Sickles, Raymond, and Foster. Never used them. Crane had a lot of fun with big, bodacious sound effects in Wash Tubbs and Captain Easy. And it was fun for us in those lickety-wop, lickety-splat fight scenes. He was playing with the medium, and his work had a very audacious tone. He could be very broad and do all these wild and crazy things and make the lettering part of the design and layout of the panel, and then be very subtle, very dramatic, very poignant. He was an excellent writer and had a good eye for design. He liked to have fun. It's Roy Crane's personality coming through, pure, unvarnished, and delightfully spunky. He's a great cartoonist, Roy Crane. I have a few of his books, hardcover editions, collections of his comic strip. Mosh says, I don't think that it matters if you go 10 pages without a single sound effect, then use it for 2 or 3 pages. I don't think the reader is aware that suddenly sound effects are present. Toth says, you can tire the reader out with it if there's too many of them. If you're going to do a Simon and Kirby story, or any Kirby story, where you've got nonstop action beginning to end, you'll get wham, bam, pow from start to finish. After the 3rd or 4th page, stuff loses its meaning. It's best to minimize use of anything like that. Then, when you do, it's a proper exclamation point to your story's high points of drama, action, etc. It's like close-ups in movies. Television has poisoned the movies with them. The close-up shot should be used as an exclamation point to come in tight on a character for dramatic effect, that emotion of that face, on that face. Older movies were mostly medium and long shots. In television, you save lots of time just by coming in tight on everybody's face as if everybody's saying something dramatic. Via lousy writing and staging, it's too simple to cut to some woman's face as she's about to cry, or some villain's face as he's about to kill somebody. It's tiring and boring and pumped up dramatics. Amash says, switching to the Cold story or the Batman story you did for Detective Comics, there are a lot of medium and long shots. Toth says, because I had a lot of things to show, to encompass it all. You have to pull back to show it. Amash says, then as an exclamation point, there's White Devil, Yellow Devil, where the Japanese soldiers are talking about gold teeth and the guy's curling his tongue over his own. Toth says, that was an afterthought on my part. I didn't know what made me think of it. It seemed to be a nice touch if I could pull it off, but it's hard to draw, to put over clearly enough. It's true. It's a very famous panel, and he did pull it off. Check it out if you haven't. White Devil, Yellow Devil. It's in one of the Toth collection of books. Beautifully printed in there as well. Amash says, that was not in the original script. Toth said, no. That was a little personal thing because I warmed to the script. I had fun with it. I found little ways of making it more interesting to me and establishing the characters. Amash says, were you ever criticized by any of your editors besides Shelley Mayer? Toth said, Kurtzman gave me a hard time on that last story I did for him when I dared violate his set-in-cement layouts. I can't remember storytelling ever being a point of argument except in that case. Shelley gave me a holy hell for not thinking of telling the story as it should have been told, but without those Kurtzman-like strictures. Amash says, when he said that you weren't, Toth says, thinking, just trying to be cute or be the artiste. So that got kicked out of me real early. Thank God. It's hilarious. He was worried that he would get pretentious, I guess. But in terms of pretentiousness, right? People use that word a lot. Sometimes you have real lowlifes using that word. So what does that mean? That means anyone who's decent, anyone who's at all articulate, they're called pretentious. So it depends, you know. So Amash says, over time you develop a sense of what to show and how to show it. Toth said, working with good, bad, and mediocre scripts, always at the mercy of scripts. That's the thing. You didn't have to be at the mercy of scripts. You could have been writing early on, but you know, that's the thing. I just would have loved to have seen a big fat book written and drawn by him. Amash says, what writers have the best storytelling sense? Toth said John Broome, Gardner Fox, Ed Hernan, and romance writer Kim Amat at Standard, and Joe Millard. He wrote a historical novel on the Cheyenne, the reluctant warriors. The West was his favorite subject. Amash says, when you had a poorly written script, did you try to jazz it up or just get it done? Toth said, it got to the point in my ins and outs with DC in particular, where I just sent bad scripts back to them. They'd have all these flaws, but I was told not to change any of them. My argument was that somebody had better change them. If you won't allow me to do it, then use your blue pencil to change them. But since you think they're okay, then you draw them. Amash said that was unheard of. Toth said, that's why I got my reputation of being hard to work with. I demanded more of the editor, function as a bloody editor, and to make the writer function in his job better. Change, rewrite, make my job a happier one, and I'd give 110% to any script I got. I would give 0% to the turkeys I was handed time and again. It's not true though. I mean, no matter what he says, they're still damn good. I've seen things that he said that he thought he just hacked it out. They're still good. You know, Zora, for instance, he said he was real hot for it in the beginning and he got less so at the end with the editors giving it a hard time. It's still good. Maybe not by his standards, but just in terms of his compared to other cartoonists, forget about it. So Amash says, how has your animation work developed your sense of storytelling? Toth says, first, I enjoyed it because it brought me into filmmaking, closer to live action. We did have a few projects, combinations of live and animation, like Gene Kelly Meets Jack and a Beanstalk, a 90-minute TV special. Designed that and some sequence storyboarding. Then we worked on a Paramount film, a terrible sci-fi movie called Project X, where I designed costume, props, hardware, and storyboarded special effects sequences to be done in animation. But later, we shot it live action and messed around with the footage to make it peculiar looking on the cheap. What we could get away with in the editing and opticals department. He goes, I liked working in film, but was starting to lose my fascination with animation because of low quality and standards. We had a whole studio full of people, some of whom cared, but too many who didn't. Too many who couldn't draw, let alone think. That was put to me by a director. My response was, what are they doing there? They animate and in between and can do this and that, but they can't draw? What are they in a hand-drawn medium? Why are they in a hand-drawn medium? Well, there's no answer to that. They needed warm bodies and hands, so they were there. So there they were, excuse me. Amash says, you have good instincts in knowing how a story should be told. Are you ticked off by something you watched or read because the story wasn't being told well? Toth says, there's a good point to be made about digesting bad movies, TV, or bad comic strips. By negative examples, you can learn. You can learn from others' failures as well as your own, hopefully. So even a bad film can be worth watching. You say to yourself as you watch, if the director had done this and not that, the writer had written this, not that, or the actors had played it this way instead, etc., etc., it could have been an okay movie. In studying all forms of entertainment, you can see where they came close but just missed. I see the same in lots of my work, and I wonder what the hell was I thinking of. I wasn't aware, that's all. Amash says, but wasn't animation an influence in how you approach comics? Toth says, some say it was a negative influence by stripping away more detail and technique, made my work too simple and economical, and maybe too bland or boring because I had eliminated the details that some like in my work. That made me take a second look. Amar says, did you feel that helped the pace of your storytelling? Toth said, staging, composition, and layout is what moves the eye across a panel. Stripper page. Staging, composition, and layout is what moves the eye across a panel. Stripper page. And how much copy you've got to read before you get out of one panel into the next. It all has a bearing on it. Being tied down to heavy copy just stops everything right there. Even as you're trying to pull the eye out and across the panel, you're fighting that big, lumpy, heavy balloon that's sitting up there. Simplifying the artwork helps, but that's only part of the other elements working in concert or opposition with each other. So it's not just simplicity, because you could do very simple stuff and still the reader's eye would drag. We talked about Mobius as the talent for simplicity and economy, but there are times when it's so bloody simple that it's like wallpaper. Simplicity alone is not the problem solver, 100%. It's hard to find that fine line between too little and too much. It constantly shifts. Sometimes you touch it just right. Sometimes you miss it on one side or the other. If you're serving the story, the reader will overlook those little goofs. The last 2 pages here. This is Toth with his swashbuckling work, a real cartoony work there, and a lovely Toth presentation art for Hanna-Barbera. Proposal, Tiger Joe, courtesy Paul Revoch. Wow. So Paul has these, incredible. Okay. So Toth says, as Roy Crane said, there are many ways to stage a scene. If it's more interesting to shoot down at something, then do it. If it's interesting to shoot up at it, then do it, only when necessary. Amar says, talk about doing storyboarding for film and TV. Toth said, first of all, we're dealing with the universal sized frame dimension, shot to shot, drawing for the TV screen, where the simpler the images, the better. He says, I had control of my own cuts, dissolves, and fades in order to plus the script. Doing a complete board, the artwork would be inked blacks, often in gray tones, to better set moods or lighting effects or local colors in the compositions, and to set backgrounds back by toning them. Storyboard panels are usually quite small, 6 or 8 frames horizontally per 8.5 by 11 sheets. One must eliminate non-storytelling details to make it easily read by directors, producers, layout people, animators, and in between. So Marsh says, it must have really helped you when you came back to comics. Toth says yes, using lots of crossover tools. I also borrowed from live-action film. They're kissing cousins, storyboards, and strip continuity. You do have to know camera, animation camera, and the economies of the medium, similarly to in boarding for live action, to make it as effective as possible for the least amount of money. Amash says, let's change subjects. Did you write the chord story the way you wrote Bravo? Toth says, I wrote and drew it as I went along with a rough outline, constantly rewriting. If I hadn't run out of time, I would have lettered it, making changes as I lettered it too. Amaj says, you don't use formulas. Toth says, I hate formula. I want to break the rules, but you have to know what the rules are, which ones to break and how. I try to make each job different than the one before. If the subject was different, that did 50% of the work for me. If the writing was good, that did 40% more of my work for me. I came in for the last 10% of sweat, blood, and toil. Or that's how it seemed. Good stories almost draw themselves. Amaj says, you prefer lean scripts? Toth says, yes. Well done and lean if I can get it. Amaj says, does a lean script make storytelling easier for you? Toth says, I respect writers and artists who say much with little. A rare talent. Clark Haas, who ghosted for Roy Crane during World War II, said that Crane would sit in his studio with a legal pad and rewrite for hours, trying to get a 30-word balloon down to 10. Wow. Toth says, there's nothing more boring than a huge chunk of copy run across the page. That makes it hard for the eye to come back and pick up the next line. So make it half or third page wide and just add more lines below. Amaj says, comics are words and pictures, but it's a more visual than literary medium, it seems. Because people are more visually oriented today with television and computers, it seems as if your job would be a little tougher because you would have to do more storytelling with the pictures than you are used to doing. Toth says, I wouldn't cave into that or write down to the public. Awesome. Absolutely true. Just one example. I was encouraged early on when I was doing speeches about Islam and stuff, right? To meet the audience at their ignorance. Basically, they're ignorant, so I'm going to use different language. I'm going to use Islamism instead. Bullshit. I said, no, I know my stuff. They don't. So I'm going to try to communicate with them with what I know. I want them to know what I know. I don't want to meet them at their ignorance. I can't stand that. And so this is touching on that. Toth says, I wouldn't cave into that or write down to the public. I want to give the reader the benefit of the doubt. I want the reader to hang in there with me and read all of it. Let's not dumb down everything written in America. We've done too much of that already. It's terrible. Mash says, let's talk about balloon placement. Toth says, all subjective to the story. Not enough thought is given to where captions and word balloons ought to be in relation to the picture and what should be first seen or read by the reader. Many times it's a picture that should be viewed first, then dialogue or caption. That makes it tricky. It's often the reverse. Then you have redundancies, which I used to fight about on my Zorro series. There would be a caption in every panel to tell you what you were seeing in the artwork. Oh, that's terrible. You always want to counter what's happening. You always want to give something that's not being shown in the text. Because then you would have word balloons that would tell you what you were seeing in the artwork. So everything was redundant and boring. How much do you need? How much can you eliminate? He goes on, he goes, after so many years of this stuff, I finally got disgusted with it. I cross out a lot, try to make the point without all the verbiage. Bumping heads with editors and writers who thought it was all carved in stone forced me to give up and write my own stories. Hell yeah. It was the advent of the European market opening up and copyrighted material being acknowledged that helped. I was able to suffer my own writing and nobody else's. It's funny. Amash says, Will Eisner said in an interview that he puts all the word balloons in first. Whoa. Ha. Toth says, that's goofy. I used to do that myself, but that's wrong. There are many times you'll have to lower a balloon and float it somewhere in the art to suit the action. Well, today we have digital lettering. And I hand lettered all of my first comic book, Table for One. I hand lettered the first 2 issues of Pigman, and then I digitally lettered issue 3. And I'm not going back to hand lettering. While I love the process, while I love that having it on the original art, it could be tedious and it could be painful after hours and hours of doing it. More so than just drawing, because drawing you're going wide. Lettering you're going very short strokes for hours at a time, and it gets a little painful at times. I remember that was the one thing that I really, in the morning sometimes I was like, damn, my hand feels really tight. But yeah, the digital lettering, it's great. And you can put it anywhere you want and edit as you go. You could type it all in. And you always want to refine. You always want to get to the core of what the word balloon has in it. Anyway, so he says here, bumping heads, European. Okay. To put he goes, design the flow of the balloon to balloon or caption to caption to work together. To put the first things first, for the eye to read artwork first and then balloons, or vice versa. To design accordingly, to marry up with following panels' problems. He goes, comic book pages offered us more room than comic strip artists had. They were locked in, except for Sunday pages like Captain Easy, Little Nemo, Crazy Cat, and Prince Valiant. He goes, but consistently, we could do no more. Break it up any way we wanted within reason, but it's been misunderstood and abused. The Marvel method, also used at DC with artwork drawn, caring where dialogue and captions will be squeezed because they haven't been written yet. And then the writer comes in and writes after the fact. Nonsense. Our old way was simplest and easiest, the cartoonist being responsible for placing all copy. This Marvel DC post-art copywriting device institutionalizes the ignorance of the cartoonist because he has not been made to deal with the problem of what to do with captions, balloons, and how it fits into artwork, which suffers because there's lots of jamming of overlapping balloons and captions over it. Amash says, there are a lot of people painting their stories these days, but I think their work leaves much to be desired. Toth says they're trying to be painters and illustrators, but they don't know how to tell a story. A few spot illustrations does not a comic book page make. He goes, they're very self-involved and won't bend to the needs of the page. They're concerned only with their painting. They think sticking a few illustrations on a page constitutes storytelling. It doesn't. Too many rely on photographs, and it's all lifeless, expressing nothing. Let them do that in a magazine illustration. It doesn't belong in comics unless done by a worthy storyteller. Because there's a lot coming out of Europe. They're doing it better than we are. But still, it's not comics. They're not storytellers. These guys are dealing without structure. There's no foundation for what they're doing. They're building a house without any walls. There's no foundation in storytelling, and nobody's teaching this. Amash says, but people seem to like it. Toth says, do they really? Did that book really sell? Amash says, in my shop, the first issue sold very well, but the second issue bombed. Same with Sienkiewicz, I believe that's how you pronounce it. Bill Sienkiewicz. His work doesn't sell as well as it once did. Toth says he's a brilliant kid, but his stuff doesn't make sense. It's hilarious. He's really good, Bill Sienkiewicz. But I get what Toth's saying. He's a brilliant kid, but his stuff doesn't make sense. It doesn't hang together as storytelling. Corbin does good work, but I'd like to see him work in a different context. He understands story, but technique gets in the way. There's a sense of immediacy I like in the work of those who can set something down, and it's there to be understood and enjoyed. They speak in the language, the grammar of our medium at its best. Okay, everyone, so that's one of the Toth cards that he did for me, that he wrote me. So tomorrow we're going to, I guess, spend, Paul Roach does the interview with him as well. Awesome. So we'll read polls tomorrow. Man, these are incredible. Look at the wealth of this. And we'll read some of people are saying about Toth in short little clips here. So thanks for spending time with me here. This is a master, and I think if you're watching this, if you're listening, I think you're starting to get an idea of Toth. So by the time we get to his art, I think you'll have a better understanding of it, as will I. I mean, I'm always learning new stuff from him. So thanks for being here again, and take care. Until next time, be well.